Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into this episode, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Originally, John and I were going to pick, like 10 or so horror movies to talk about that are our favorites or have meaning to us. And as usual, what happens when John and I get together is the show just went in a completely much bigger direction. So there are a lot of horror movies that we're going to be talking about going way back to the beginning. And there's probably going to be a lot of spoilers in here. So if there's some movies that we start to talk about and you haven't seen it, even though these movies have been out for a while, a lot of them you may not have seen yet. They might be ones that you just never got to or ones that you're just finding out about. So feel free to skip ahead, skip around the episode, maybe have someone else listen to it and point out some films that might be spoilers for you, however you want to do it. But it is a great conversation that John and I had, and it became a much bigger episode than I had originally intended. But for you guys who've been listening to the show for a while, you know that that's what happens when John and I get together. So enjoy the show and happy Halloween. Hello and welcome to another episode of the HaskinCast Podcast. I am your host, Scott Haskin, here with my good buddy, John Mottola. John, how are you?
Hey, Scott, what's going on?
Well, we're doing something a little different today. First of all, happy Halloween to you.
Yeah, ooh, bleh. I'm John Lugosi Mottola.
Oh, classic right there. I gotta say, as we're recording this at the end of September, our temperatures went yesterday. We were 93 degrees. Today, our high is 76.
Wow.
So I'm going to unfreeze my hoodie and get it ready for action because I think it's time to go.
Well, right now we're at rainy, drizzly, and 56. But tomorrow it's supposed to be 73. So who knows? Who knows what? How the weather works.
I'm not a drug guy. I'm really not. I have a beer or a drink now and then, but that's about it. I don't know what Mother Nature's on, but I want $20 worth. So you guys at the Deep Purple Podcast are still continuing your streak. You've had some close calls recently with missing an episode, but you have managed to pull off an episode every week for going on 5 years now. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You know, I tell people when they're thinking about getting into podcasting, one of the most important things is consistency. Your fans become dependent as having you as part of their schedule. Like when I was doing the Uriah Heep podcast, it was 4 days a week. People would walk their dog in the morning, listen to me on their commute, but it was very consistent, and then Wednesdays always felt kind of weird to them because there was no Magicians podcast show. But I would imagine it's the same way with you guys. Your show comes out late Sunday night here in LA time. And it's sometimes as soon as I see the notification, I'm like, great, I can't wait for the new episode. I'm going to listen. Sometimes I don't listen till the morning, but it has definitely become a staple in my schedule as well.
Oh, thank you. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
It definitely hasn't been easy. Nate and I have been joking on and off air that we didn't realize that this past summer was going to be so challenging between, vacation time, work, family obligations over the summer, that we were cutting it close because anybody that knows us knows that we'll bank episodes. Like we'll have like a 2 or 3, buffer. And we were going on like, hey, we need to record this episode in a couple of days or we have nothing. So we had to try and hurry up and get one going. But as of this recording, we banked one for the first time in weeks. And so we're very excited. We have an additional one. And, as of now, when this episode comes out, we've actually emailed each other our schedule so we can actually physically plan out times so we can do our traditional taking the month of December off from recording every week. So we're coming up with schedules. I'm throwing some ideas out there to make Hughes-a-ween possibly happen.
Ooh, well, that would be awesome. And it's interesting too because you guys did have a crazy summer. On top of everything else, you went to Italy. And so now you're and you did an episode from there. So you're recording from the other side of the world. I mean, you guys are diehard, and I really, really respect and appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was, well, I mean, I think that there are some really good podcasts that I enjoy that occasionally will take a week off because somebody is sick, or they don't have the time, or whatever. And it's not that often, but it's just we kind of set this personal goal for ourselves, like we're not going to do that. No, short of like a catastrophe that is beyond our control, life-changing event, something like that. We're committed to pulling one off every week.
Yep. And you've done it. But when one of those shows though that you listen to does that, doesn't that week feel a little bit empty?
That well, actually, it's more like amnesia for me. I'm like, oh, I don't remember recording this.
I mean, like one of the shows that you listen to when they take a week off for one of those reasons, doesn't it kind of feel weird as a listener to not have that as part of your routine?
Yeah, but there's also it's also like kind of like a sense of relief too, because sometimes it's like, oh good, it's one less podcast I have to catch up on, because sometimes I'll have a backlog of them, I'll be like, and then there are other times where it's like I don't have a huge backlog, but the times where I mostly do them, like shit, I'm like behind on listening to like 3 or 4 shows, and they're all going to be an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, some of them each. I don't listen to a lot of short podcasts except yours, minus the ones that I'm on.
Right.
So it's sometimes it's always like it's a race to catch up. So sometimes somebody will take a week off and you'll be like, okay, good. That means I could cross that one off for this week and listen to these other ones. But
yeah, and I'm on a couple of podcasts now too, because I do Backtracks Aerosmith Revisited with Corey Morissette, and which you've been a guest on a couple times, and we've run into that same thing, because now he had the 100th anniversary of And the Podcast Will Rock. They did like a 3-hour recording for that. Then they had another. They finished off another album. So they did a rating of that album with a panel. That was another 3-hour show. Then he does a show with Kevin Brown called The Ultimate Catalog Clash. And so he'd been recording episodes of that. And then we were trying to get in. And then he also does Backtrack's theme music with John Mariano. So it's like he's got all these podcasts, and we started getting behind, because I like to have at least 1 or 2 episodes on that show banked also, because it's not 100% in my control. I can't just whip out an episode and put it out. And he does all the heavy lifting on that one. So I'm like, man, we got to get one. So we normally record on Monday nights, and we didn't record on Monday because he couldn't do it. And then Tuesday, I think they were recording the anniversary. And then Tuesday I was recording a show. And then Wednesday he couldn't do it. And then we were like, Thursday we're recording for next week's show. And we're like, we've never cut it this close. And we got nothing in the tank. That just makes me nervous. I don't like that.
Yeah, that's so you can relate.
Oh, for sure. But we're not here to talk about other podcasts. We're here to talk about horror movies, because it is Halloween, and did this a few years ago with a buddy of mine here in Vegas. And I thought, you're a big fan of horror movies. You'd be a perfect one to talk to about this. First, I just did recorded a panel that came out at the beginning of October. Or I'm sorry, on September 30th, with the cast of a horror film that was shot in Phoenix called Maya, with some friends of mine that had done the film, and some people I met for the first time. And we were talking about people that have preconceived notions when it comes to especially like independent horror film. If it's low budget, we assume the effects are going to be crappy, or it's going to be a bad script, or they're not going to have good actors. You see a new film pop up on whatever service you're watching, whether it be Hulu, Netflix, whatever, and you're like, you see it's not a major studio film. Do you kind of like back off from it for a second, go, well, it's an indie, it could suck, it could be okay?
It really depends. I mean, the films that we're going to talk about are from a much different mold and era and everything. So if we're fast forwarding to like the present, or we're staying in the present for now, like streaming, and you can go on and just look at anything. So if I'm on like Pluto, Peacock, like whatever streaming service, HBO Max, just pick any, Netflix, you could just search for horror movies and see the newest one. And then I try to like look at like reviews first of all, but I don't always rely on them, because it's like, what some people think stinks is like, really good to somebody else.
Right.
But I'll typically look, I mean, I won't look and see who's in it anymore. I'll just like kind of take a look at the, believe it or not, I think like the the art, like the, what do you call it, the movie art,
The cover art. Mm-hmm.
or like the thumbnail or whatever for the horror movie will draw me in, like the maybe the title. Read the synopsis, see if it looks interesting, and then, these days you have the luxury of just putting it on, and if it looks like it's not going to be good, you could just turn it off. It doesn't cost you anything, right? It's not like you paid to go into the theater or paid to go to the video store and rent it like we used to. So I think it makes it a lot easier to kind of cycle through and like take that chance. So I do take a lot more chances than I think I would have, because I mean, I think I told you I recently watched a couple that I thought were not that bad, but it's like you can kind of tell by the picture quality, the acting. If anything says like social media influencers, like, and then I'm like, nope, like those are the ones that I don't like, where it's just like somebody, like they're all from like the point of view of somebody doing like a TikTok live or something like that.
Yeah.
I just think that those feel very forced, like somebody's being like cyber bullied or something, and it's like kind of a found footage or a point of view of the character ones. Those I don't like. I mean, it's got to be a really exceptional movie for me to want to see that. And even like found footage type or point of view movies like from back in the day, I really wasn't a big fan of, like Paranormal Activity or Blair Witch and stuff like that. It was never really my thing.
I'll tell you, I was fascinated with the Blair Witch story because it was sold so well. I've never seen marketing like that. They had the documentary that was on, I think, the Sci-Fi Channel. I mean, they did everything to make it so believable. And I kept the premise in my head of, there's no way the families of these people are going to allow footage of their deaths to be seen. Like, that was the thing I kept hanging on to. Like, there's no way this could be real. And I went to the theaters. I was living in Denver at the time, and I went to the midnight showing, and it was foggy out, which was not a common occurrence for Denver, but it would happen every once in a while. So there's this mist out. I lived right off of Lake Marsden, so I've got the woods, I've got the lake, I've got the mist. It's the midnight showing. It's in the autumn, like the perfect setup to go see this movie. And I go in, I sit in my chair, I'm waiting, and there's people just filing in, and then there's people sitting on the floor, and I'm like, what the fuck? They oversold the theater.
Wow.
And so, through the whole movie, everything was quiet, and then the movie ends, the lights come up, nobody moves, nobody says a word. It's just everyone's frozen. And still in my head, I'm like, that wasn't real. Very well done, but not real. And then in the silence, you hear this one woman just say this: get me the hell out of here. And then everybody stood up and they're pushing through the door. Like, it was like the cue. Like, everybody's like, yeah, I need to get out of here right fucking now.
Wow.
That was probably more of an intense experience than the movie itself was. But the brilliance of it was the marketing. I mean, just absolutely amazing. So when they announced the second one was being made, I was really excited. And then I was disappointed because I found out it wasn't the original filmmakers. And I'm like, all right, here we go. Off. It's going to be a moneymaker thing now.
Right.
And so I remember sitting in the theater with my brother, and he goes, if this movie starts with rock music, it's going to suck. Every movie that's a horror movie that starts out with rock music sucks. And sure enough, there comes the guitars.
Oh no.
And it wasn't that good. The premise of it was okay, but it really wasn't that good. And I'm surprised that they didn't try to make another one, because the original guys wanted to do a prequel and tell the Ellie Kedward story. But instead somebody just came and rebooted it and did a shitty job, and there you go.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm not surprised.
But it made me think about like the 70s, where there wasn't a huge precedence for really intense horror movies like The Exorcist or Halloween. And I remember my mom telling me stories of going to see the original Halloween and people just running from the theater, or, just like throwing up for being just scared, or like having physical reactions. And I think, what do you have to do to somebody nowadays? Because I think we're really desensitized by it now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I mean, that I think it's, let's just stay in the present. I was like, I think that's a good place to start, right? I was I heard or I was reading somewhere recently, like within the past few days, and I can't remember where it was from, whereas Halloween and trick-or-treating isn't like what it used to be.
Mhm.
Like I think that like they said that like the whole cosplay aspect of life has become
Oh,
so year round that like doing it like getting dressed up on Halloween and going out trick-or-treating or going to costume parties doesn't seem to be as big of a culture as it used to be. Because I mean,
interesting.
if you think, and I mean, I kind of agree too. And I mean, I don't know how much of it too is like, me getting older and like not doing it myself, or having my nieces don't live here, so I don't get to experience that with them,
Mhm.
what they do. But how big of a culture is it really anymore? Because I mean, you see people like, on social media and, like Comic Cons and stuff like that, like all different times a year doing that kind of thing. And so it almost kind of takes like the unique nature out of, this is the one day a year that you get to dress up and be something else and, do that. And so it's just like I kind of feel that that's down that same road that you
Mhm.
were talking about, is just like it's not, it kind of lost that unique quality, somewhere along the way, like, in the present day, is that, what do you need to do to have it be special now,
Right.
you know?
Well, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. And you look at like, I get, for some reason, I get a lot of TikTok videos in my Instagram feed. And there's a lot of
Yeah,
that. There's a lot of just people dressing up in costumes for no reason, just to do it.
yeah,
And you're right, that really does take. But I mean, people our age wouldn't trick or treat. But I do have a couple friends that are very like every year they're like, man, I really want to do something good this year, and very much into Halloween. But they are not people that do something else throughout the year. They don't cosplay. They don't go to Comic Con, that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess it would come back to then just the freshness for little kids, where they're
right.
just discovering it and what Halloween would be for them. But they're probably going to have dress up days at school more so than we did, and more events. Like we're taking the kids to Comic Con this weekend, and
Right.
they're not. Yeah, they're probably going to be less sensitive to it than we were.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, before we get into the movie picks, and I don't know if you have any, but I have a couple of honorable mentions that aren't really horror movies that I think are kind of thought of that way. The first one is a little movie called Stephen King's It, and I'm talking about the original one that
Mm.
was done. I had the pleasure of having drinks with the composer. He won a Grammy for that score. It was one of the two scores that inspired me to get into film composition. And I can't remember if I mentioned it casually or if he asked me, but I said, this film is not a horror film. It's a thriller, but it's not really a horror film.
Mm.
Um, and he said, thank you. I didn't score it that way. And he didn't. There's a lot of like happy circus music in there that's just creepy enough, but kind of falls into the happy circus mode. But it's thought of as horror, I think, just because it's Stephen King.
Hmm.
But Stand By Me wasn't horror, and that was Stephen King,
Right.
you know.
But it
But
was very intense.
it was very intense. But I really don't look at it as a horror film. I look at it as like just a good thriller.
Yeah, I would agree. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I just remember it was very like, because Stephen King could be depending on how a filmmaker interprets it as well, could be very just have a type of feel to it, not necessarily horror, but just kind of this kind of underlying like brooding type of feeling, but maybe a thriller, maybe unsettling, but not necessarily like what you would consider a horror movie.
Right. Exactly. The next one I want to mention is a movie called Tusk. I just recently saw this. This was directed by Kevin Smith, who is not a horror director, not at all. But the premise is that Justin Long is this. I don't know if he was a podcaster or a DJ or what, but he's like one of those over the top, type characters, and he ends up going to Canada and goes meets this guy, and it's a whole setup, and the guy like physically turns him into a walrus. He's like, I miss my
Yeah,
walrus. And did you see it?
I did, and it was very. I thought it was really disturbing.
But that's it. It was disturbing, but it wasn't a horror movie. It was almost borderline comedy in some ways, because Kevin Smith has those kind of characters, like the Yoga Hosers girls were in it, and then he had the meeting at the restaurant with Justin Long's friends, and that was like over the top type characters. And I'm like, if he really buckled this down, this could have been an amazing horror movie. And I really feel like it was a huge missed opportunity because he didn't go that route. It's not his thing.
Right.
And there's rumors he's making a second one. I don't know where you go with it from there, but
yeah, right.
But,
well, I mean, yeah, that's I see what you mean, where it's like it starts off that way and then goes in a different direction, and you kind of think for the remainder of the time, it's like, if it only stayed on that first track, then it could have been like a great horror movie, and instead it went off into being just like bizarre or like almost borderline comedy, or who even knows what. You can't even classify it.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but at first I was like, you know what, he's kind of an ass. I don't mind that this is happening to him that much, but then by the end of it, you kind of do feel sorry for him. But there was like half the movie, I'm like, I kind of don't care that this happened to this guy, because he's so over the top and so manipulating and judgmental that I'm like, if it's going to happen to somebody, I'd rather happen to somebody like that than like the nice girl who was just on her way home from the grocery store getting, for her sick child or whatever. I think it's a better premise for me when it's somebody I don't care that something bad happens to them. I'm a little bit distant. I'm able to be a little distant from it.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. I think a true horror movie is where you I personally like and I think a lot of people do put themselves in the main character's shoes, thinking like, oh my God, like I can't, like I would die if that happened to me, or I would be terrified if that happened to me, or if that were me, how would I get it? That's why a lot of times people just be like, no, don't go upstairs, like, go out the side or something like that, like you're yelling at the screen for like what you would do.
Right.
So, and that, I think that's a direct impact on, like, a lot of movies will have you put yourself in the main character's shoes and kind of empathize with them. It's just like you almost feel like it's happening to you, and that's why it's so scary.
Yeah, to me, if I can watch a movie and not realize I'm watching a movie, like, because a lot of times I'll just have something on and I'll kind of more listen to it than watch it. But if I actually just sit down and watch a movie and I don't see the edge of the screen, they've got me inside the movie. I don't realize I'm in a theater or I'm in my home watching a television screen. I'm like, I'm dialed in,
Yeah.
It does feel like it's happening to you. And I think part of the key to that is so many horror movies bank on isolation.
Right.
That's why so many of them are shot in the woods, because you can't run to the police station and get immediate help. You don't have neighbors whose doors you can knock on and hope they're home or hope they'll help you. The isolation trick is very big in horror, and it works very well because also you as a viewer, you feel isolated with whoever that main character is. And I really like that. But it's kind of been done to death.
Well, that's why, in order to go forward, you have to go backwards and see where it's all built on. So my question to you is, how far back do you go into your horror movie knowledge and your love for scary movies? Like, what's the oldest one that you like?
Well, I have this one and then a huge gap, so I'll premise it with that. The original Nosferatu.
Okay, so that's near the beginning. So,
that movie, a part of it I think is the way, looking at the footage now, how grainy and the wash of white coming in and out of the film. I think that almost makes it even more intense. But I remember the first time I saw that footage was in the video Under Pressure that David Bowie did with Queen. For whatever reason, they had shots of that film, and I asked my mom what it was, and she goes, "Oh, that's Nosferatu." She saw that in the theater. And I'm like, I can't imagine, again, no sensitivity or just 100% sensitivity to horror films at the time, because they didn't have the precedence that we do when we go to a movie now. That must have just been the most horrific thing to watch in the theater at the time.
And that's and I mean, that's really the beginning of that, because a lot of the original horror movies came from German expressionistic cinema. Sorry, I can't get it out. Which a lot of it visually had to do with like the contrast between light and shadow, and just really had this sense of like foreboding to it. And so a lot of the early horror films were based on that. So like Nosferatu, for instance, was that was a German expressionist horror film, which was a silent film, and relied on a lot of those techniques, like a lot of like light and dark, a lot of like scary imagery.
Yeah.
And I mean, you have to think too that like you watch it now and you can't put yourself in like the present mind frame. You have to watch it and kind of like be in that mindset for it. It's just like, how would people back where there was like no social media, no like you seeing everything or knowing everything, you just see these crazy images on screen, and a lot of it the typical public wouldn't understand too, because I mean they don't understand the contrast that's going on visually, or a lot of them would be I can't remember offhand if it had a musical score. I know a lot of silent films had like a live musical score.
Yeah, right.
As well, but just seeing it that way, and just being like what the hell is this, with like no point of reference. And that's what made it so scary, is because there was a lot less connectivity and knowledge back then, and that's what made those movies scary. Is also because jumping ahead to the slasher films, like like 50 some odd years later, it was really what was implied back then, as opposed to like having actual gore on the screen.
Right.
So just like Count Nosferatu, or Count I think it was Count Orlok, just like doing that, like just coming up like stiff as a board, just like coming up from his coffin and everything. You're just like, what the fuck is this? It's
Right.
like crazy. And from a point of view of now, you look at it and some of the things, you're just like, how did they achieve these effects back then? And like, I mean, if you look at it and you're like, oh, it's this creaky old black and white movie with like bad effects and everything, you're not going to enjoy it.
Yeah, if it's like Plan 9 from outer space, where you can see the string on the UFO.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, this was actually done with like, with intent, and I'd actually seen it and gotten it on multiple DVD versions over the years with like these different like orchestral scores on it. I remember at some point, when I was younger, they had it playing in like a theater around here with like a live score, like a restored print type of thing. It was very cool to see it that way. But that was widely considered to be like that, and there was the I can't remember the Lon Chaney movie. Were widely considered like some of the first horror movies.
Well, he was a master. I mean, that guy would put himself through all kinds of things but thinking about what you said, like how the movies were made, a lot of the effects of things that were done back then were, I mean, they were all practical because they didn't have any computer generation or anything. But
right.
Thinking about like when you see the guy that's hanging out on the pole over the side of the building, yeah, that building's only a half a story high, but he's really on that pole.
Right.
And when the bus drives by and he grabs it, the side pole, and swings himself onto the back of the bus, that's really a guy doing that. There's no special effect there. That's really the bus driving by and him grabbing the pole and swinging himself onto the back. Very dangerous stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no CGI and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But a lot of sleight of hand, type of stuff.
Yeah. But in terms of the impact of it, the one thing I don't know is what books were people reading back then. So did they get their experience in horror and maybe a little bit of desensitizing through reading books and using their own imagination, and then the stuff comes out on the screen and they're like, okay, now this is the kind of stuff I've been reading about coming to life? Or was this really like a first time experience?
I mean, I would like to think too. And I mean, I got into horror when I was like, really young. And, when I was in like junior high and high school and everything, I bought like every book that I could get my hands on about horror movies. So, I mean, my knowledge is like, I have to kind of dust it off for this. But, I think that a lot of people back then were just like reading a lot more than they were seeing. I mean, like when, like the, especially the 20s, like after the Great Depression was, people were, I mean, the popular theme around then, if you read historically, is that like after the Great Depression, or when the beginning of the Great Depression, a lot of people were into escapism. So they were like going to the movies in droves. That's when cinema was huge.
Yeah.
Prior to that, it was big. It was more of a novelty because it was like, it was before talkies, and so I think it was around like 1929. Like they had, I think it was the first talkie with the Al Jolson.
Yeah.
How come I can't think of what it's called?
It's escaping me.
I should know this.
Well, like you said, you're dusting off old info there.
Yeah, it was come on. I know this. It was The Jazz Singer, that's it. I was gonna say The Wedding Singer.
Was it really? The Wedding Singer, yeah, slightly different movie.
Yeah, the first talking picture was The Jazz Singer, 1927. So that's and then the rest of the studios were really trying to keep up with that, and so in the late 20s to the early 30s, like they were really trying to crank them out, and like a lot of the acting and like the audio was very kind of off because people were doing stage acting, so they were just like these big exaggerated motions, and like and they didn't know how to speak and they didn't know how to mic things, so a lot of those early talkies were really bizarre, to say the least, just like almost laughable, some of them. But as you got into the the 30s, that was where the golden age of horror movies started, and that's where I got into them. And the first, because I like was telling you before the show that I split my love for horror movies into like 3 segments, and the first one is the 30s and the 40s, which the 30s I like better because they were I felt really like really heavy on that German expressionistic cinema. They got the atmosphere of the movies were really down, like Frankenstein, Dracula. The big ones were the Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff films, especially where they starred together, were like my favorites because I'm like, oh, those are the giants. There was like, the two. And the first one that I saw them in was actually not even one of their more famous films. It was called The Raven, which was from 1935. And a lot of people, kind of consider that to be a very kind of like pedestrian effort, not a lot of atmosphere to it. And Karloff had top billing, and he wasn't even like really considered the star in that movie. It was really Lugosi's vehicle. And I always really loved him because he was just a very, English was not his first language. He was a stage actor, so he had a lot of those big, like movements, and like the way he spoke was like a result of that. So that's why the whole like, bleh,
and he had such a great voice for it too, because he had that kind of deep, boisterous voice. But so now that you're saying that, though, I have to think that there were horror novels and things prior to this, because, well, thinking like Edgar Allan Poe was before all of that.
Yeah. And a lot of stuff
was
came
that
from
the Raven based on Poe's, or was this a different Raven?
No, it was the Raven based off of Poe's Raven, and that's why I think a lot of these were like Dracula was based off of like Bram Stoker's Dracula, but the version we know with Lugosi in it was based off of the stage play version, which he starred in. And I was reading, I remember reading a book about it and just like getting these vivid images of thinking like, wow, like the stage play, like I wish I could have seen the stage play in the late 20s, because that sounded so much cooler than what the movie was. Just like the stuff visually they did, and like how he presented himself, which is what he brought to the role, which is why it seems so exaggerated and over the top, is because they had to tell him to tone it down for film, because film acting and stage acting are 2 different things. And I think that there was a lot of that, like they had the Raven, they had Dracula, they had I want to say, was it the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? There were a bunch of like,
The Mummy was a little bit later. Was that right around that time?
No, The Mummy was early 30s as well. With like
Okay.
that was another one with Karloff, which was definitely like that was a whole different atmosphere too. It's like but I definitely do think that they came from from works and novels. A lot of stuff came from like H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe and like those kind
Yeah.
of like horror, Mary Shelley, the
Mhm.
Frankenstein.
Right.
So a lot of it came from like these works from like the 1800s and stuff. But like you had something like Dracula and Frankenstein, which were very atmospheric in like a horror, like a supernatural type of way. And then you had something like The Mummy, which was supernatural too, but the setting was like an it started off in like I think that they were doing an archaeological dig in like Egypt or something.
Mm.
So the whole thing, like the kind of Egyptian symbols and like going into the tomb and everything like that, it had a different kind of horror element to it
Yeah.
than the cobwebs and the dark castle of Dracula or the laboratory of Frankenstein, like, but they were still in that same mold. So you had those guys like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman
Mhm.
was another one, which was great because that was based on like lore.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember that, but there was the old gypsy. You've seen it
Oh, a long
before?
time ago. Yeah.
So there was a part where the old gypsy, who was the Bela Lugosi, was in that with a bit part, and Lon Chaney Jr. was the Wolf Man, and the old gypsy, who was Bella's mother, and his character was Bella. She recited this poem, or this kind of like a curse or a saying, and it sounded like very ancient and old, and oh, where did that come from? And it turns out that like in the all the reading that I did was is like the screenwriters just kind of came up with it, and you think like, oh, it's this old like werewolf thing, like kind of an ashes to ashes, dust to dust type of thing, and they were just
Right.
like,
Yeah.
as the water runs into the sea, and it's very poetic, and you're just like, wow, where did that, like, how old is that? And they're just like, they came up with it in the 40s. It's
Right.
like, oh
Right.
wow.
Yeah. Well,
But
I
I
mean,
mean, very
imagine
creative.
like being the first person or the first group of people to go into the tombs in Egypt and see a mummy, and you open up the sarcophagus and you see all these bandages. You're like, the hell is this? I mean,
Yeah,
that must have been just a shocking,
but let alone it
it's
coming to life.
yeah. I mean, it's not a stretch to take that concept then and turn it into something that would scare people. But I look at the original Frankenstein movie, and I mean, obviously, it's huge commentary on society, and I think what plays today. If somebody were to see a creature, we hear about cryptids and Bigfoots and all this that people see and they shoot at it or they're terrified of it and all this. I'm like, it's really no different than Frankenstein because they didn't know he had humanity. They didn't know he was a compassionate person. They didn't
Right.
understand all that, and he didn't mean to kill the girl. It happened, but he just didn't understand his own body. I don't know that I mean, I know it's categorized as a horror movie, but I don't really know that I see it that way. I kind of see it more like a Twilight Zone episode.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess there were some classic scenes in Frankenstein that are considered horror, like the scene where he's coming to life.
Yeah.
The scene where he's getting chased by the villagers, and they set the castle on fire.
Mhm.
That type of thing. But everything in between, it's very poignant, because you have this, and that's just the thing that a lot of horror movies now I think don't have, is just kind of like that sympathetic character, because like you said, he doesn't, he's he's in an outrage because he doesn't know what's happening to him, and he's just
Right.
kind of walking around and he's trying to understand, like, friend and being alone, and like who he can trust, who he can't trust, and then he has no control over his emotions when things don't go his way.
Right.
He doesn't understand what happened when he drowned the girl, and and then so you almost feel bad for him at the end when the villagers are chasing him and he's just like running away, like, what the fuck did I do? I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
he
like,
doesn't even know how to operate his own body, let alone
right.
everything else. And so I really look at that as more of a tragedy, a tragic tale, than I do a horror movie. But then if I go back and think about, okay, when this came out, what was the standard of a horror. I mean, obviously, yeah, it would have been a terrifying film for people to see this creature coming to life, which obviously, by the way, was the inspiration for Darth Vader, the first time that Darth Vader rises in the suit in Revenge of the Sith. Very obviously that Frankenstein moment recreated in space. But and the other thing too is the editors. I mean, here the editors have been working with this silent film, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh yeah, you got to do sound too, by the way." And like, God, you just doubled my workload.
Yeah. But I mean, you think from like say 1927 to like when these movies came out, like 1930, 31, 32. I mean, that's like what, 3, 4, 5 years of them trying to have to perfect that. And like, you see some of these movies and you're just like, well, I mean, it's obviously not up to the standard of today, but just keep your brain back then. And it's like, wow, they really, progressed with like, acting, dialogue, like different sound effects, like really quickly. And like, I did a great job with it because she also had to add in like scoring with that too, because you're scoring a movie and you have the dialogue and, a lot of the, and I mean, we could spend all day talking about this, like how how all this works with the movies, but that would have to be another episode.
Right, yeah. But you're absolutely right. And I think nowadays, even though we have special effects, I think it's harder to come up with something that hasn't already been done. Whereas then there was nothing, there was nothing preceding it. There was no, we did that in the last movie. It was like, I have an idea and we're going to do this on this one or whatever, because there was no precedent.
Right. And I mean, and I think that, people didn't know what to expect because they didn't have all this stimulus. They weren't bombarded with stuff from Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and streaming and just being able to see everything. So when you did go there, that was your one time to see like these crazy stunts and sleight of hand and done from like with like editing and stuntmen and whatever else. And so that's why, like, I know that they're pretty obvious picks, but like those universal ones like Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein, the Mummy are some of my favorites. The Raven was definitely my first favorite. That's one to check out, whereas it's like Lugosi is a doctor who builds, for some reason, he just has this insane obsession with Poe's torture devices and builds a museum of them in his house and winds up having a group of people over for the weekend and lures them into the basement and like gets them into these torture devices, which is a pretty wild concept if you think about it for 1935, right? And then at the end, like he winds up getting spoiler alert, he winds up getting thrown into the room where the walls are closing in on him and he gets trapped, like somebody escapes and like is able to trap him. And I read a lot of things whereas it's just like when he's screaming at the end, is he screaming in horror or is he screaming in ecstasy because he's so obsessed with Poe that like his death would be like the culmination of like everything that he was obsessed with, or is he like really, or is he scared that he's ready to die by his own hand basically?
And that's the kind of movie I like, that has that twist at the end that just kind of, I don't know if it gives that person their just desserts or just it's like you live by the sword, you die by the sword kind of thing. But that's another like perfect Twilight Zone episode type thing, because it always ended with that irony or that shock at the end, that I love so much. And I know that's TV and not movie, but it was really along those same lines.
And I mean there was another, I believe there was another Raven that was released around that time, which was Lugosi and Karloff, which was more of a really kind of just dark, like you were talking about movies like say an honorable mention that is not really a horror movie. It was a really kind of bizarre, like just a visually bizarre, like conceptually bizarre movie about like Lugosi and Karloff were both former war buddies or like war rivals, and like they met up at one of their houses, and it was kind of one of these things where they're like yeah, we used to hate each other and I'm going to kill you. He goes, so come on in. It was like a cat and mouse type of game. Like Karloff invited Lugosi into his house and he stayed there, but the whole time it was like very like fake cordial to the people around them, but they're really trying to like kill each other. And it was just a really kind of interesting, like, I think it might have been described as like an ultra modern for the time movie, because like the sets of like, Karloff's house was very unusual looking, it wasn't like you just walked in, it was like, a house in the 30s, it was like the architecture and everything was very weird and the themes were weird. And
interesting. I'll have to check that out.
yeah,
it kind of reminds me of that movie The Edge with Alec Baldwin and Anthony Hopkins, where that's not the one I'm thinking of. It was the one with John Travolta where he was a Russian soldier.
oh, I don't know.
I can't remember who the other guy was that was in it. Anyway, it was kind of like that. Like he invited him into his house. He saved him. He's like, no, I'll take care of you. But he had like screwed him over in the war, and he was really just going to kill him.
Yeah.
I
like that was
that
pretty much it.
Yeah. Now I don't know if this is moving up too far for you, so feel free to dial it back if you want. But I think about, it's not on my list, but I think about a movie like Psycho, where you're still in the black and white era, but that movie didn't really show you much, but you still got the horror out of it, which is kind of like that Blair Witch style. They never showed you the monster.
Right.
With this, I mean, they kind of did, but you didn't see the actions. Like you didn't see Janet Leigh getting all slashed up. You saw her face, you saw some blood splatter, you saw some Anthony Perkins, but you didn't see the murder.
And that was so if we want to jump ahead to that would be,
is that going too far for you?
No, because I was going to say, like, just to wrap up, like what I was saying too was like when you got from the 30s into the 40s, especially, Universal was like, pairing all the monsters together. So you had like Dracula's house featuring Frankenstein and the Mummy, and they'd all be in it together. Or like Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. It got very diluted. Or like the Mummy Part 7, and it's like, after a while they would just started to kind of crank them out. So they were like, they were good for a watch, but none of those were my favorites.
I feel like every period has gone through that. Okay, we've got money. Let's jump on it real quick while people are still interested. Let's start cranking out slasher films. Let's start cranking out Saw films. That sort of thing.
And that happened as far back then. Then.
My favorite version of The Raven was actually on The Simpsons when it was Homer and Bart, and I think it was Kelsey Grammer that narrated that, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I think it was James Earl Jones.
Oh, you're right. It was James Earl Jones.
Yeah. But yeah, close.
Yeah. He would have done a good job. But yeah, you're right, James Earl Jones. But Psycho was another isolation movie. So that's where your start. I think that might even be one of the first isolation movies where they took her and she's in a motel. She's with some strange guy running it, completely helpless to his whims.
And I mean, Hitchcock is really interesting because he's another one, could spend an entire several episodes talking about him. But at that point he was doing Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and so he was doing movies like in like lush Technicolor and all these big productions and everything. And then for this one he said, well, I want to use the technology we're doing for the show, for the TV show. Like he specifically wanted to dial it back from the bigger production he was doing to make it more like a horror movie. Which I think worked out really well. And Hitchcock movies from like from that to the Birds to God, I can name any of them. North by Northwest. There was Vertigo is another one.
Yep.
They're not horror movies per se, but if you wanted to have like a scary movie night, then you would include those.
Oh, for sure.
They have that
movies, and
they have that element.
The thing I loved about The Birds is that it was an element that you couldn't really defend yourself against because you're talking nature now. It's one thing you got some guy chasing you or whatever. There's certain things you might be able to do to defend yourself. You're talking nature. It just comes out of nowhere. And I have to give Hitchcock absolute props for taking that movie on, because any director who's worked with animals said, I'll never do that again.
Yeah.
Even if it's just one, like the guy that directed Stigmata, I remember on the commentary track, he's like, don't work with animals. He had one bird to deal with, one.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have to applaud Hitchcock for making that movie look and feel as incredible as it did, because that was a breakthrough.
And I think that he was good at really making disturbing films, which could be interpreted as horror films. So this one is disturbing on many levels, which we could get into, but talking specifically about the isolation and the horror scene, when you get to the scene where Janet Leigh is murdered in the shower, you see the knife and you see the different edits, but you never see the knife go in. And there have been a lot of reports where people are just like, oh, I couldn't watch that scene where she was stabbed. And it's like, if you watch the movie, you never saw her getting stabbed. You only saw her it suggested getting stabbed, and you heard the sound effects.
Yep.
You heard the score. You saw the editing, and it was done in a way where, you didn't actually see her getting murdered like a slasher film. So it was kind of a precursor to slasher films, a really smart way of doing, slasher without it being that way. So you never actually saw anybody in that movie getting murdered.
Right. Yeah, it's like
on film.
The infamous chainsaw scene in Scarface, where everybody's like, oh my God, that scene was so crazy. I'm like, you never saw anything. Watch it again. You saw nothing. But they do such a good job of implanting the experience of being there in your head that you think you did see it. And that sells tickets. Then you're like telling your buddy, dude, like, this movie is crazy. You got to go see it. You won't believe it. And they come out and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? I never saw it. But I think the sound design also was a big part of that. And I don't know what they used, if they used like a melon, like a butcher knife into a melon or something.
I think so. He used, I think if I can remember right, it was Casaba melon.
That would make sense. Yeah.
Right. Which he used. And there was because I remember reading about that. It was like I think that was the title of like a chapter of a book or something. And it was like talking about that.
Well, let's talk about sound design for a second, because this plays a huge role in these films, what we're talking about. If you go back and you really pay attention, and I even think about movies like Rocky, the sound of punch in Rocky is nothing like what it sounds like when you hit somebody in the face. Like, it just doesn't sound anything like it.
Yeah.
But you feel the impact because the sound is powerful. It's got a crunch to it, and you're just thinking bones breaking. That's how hard they're hitting each other. There's a whole psychological factor to it. I've done some sound design work, and I can tell you it's really interesting how creative what you actually are using to what you're using it for really is.
See, now isn't like, knowing that, I was going to ask you, like, there is I had heard about something a while ago, whereas in some scenes in movies, not just horror movies, when they need to have that underlying feeling of dread, that they have like a low tone going in that scene to kind of give the audience like that kind of feeling of like being unsettled. So what is that called?
I don't know if there's a specific name for it. I think it just depends on what you use to do it. But the strategy is basically, you don't want people to even notice it.
Right.
Just like, it's not loud enough in the mix where you're like, hey, there's a tone all of a sudden. But it's something that almost imperceptibly creeps into your ears and you feel it. Because here's the thing about film score. Unless you're specifically highlighting something, say Jaws, where you're using the cello to cue the shark is something's going on with the shark, or you want people to think something's going on with the shark. So unless you're using it for something like that, the underscore of a movie is not designed to be heard. It's designed to be felt.
Right.
And so when you have a frequency or something that you pump into it, like even a theremin, you could just have like that little one note or just a little waver in it, and you don't really want people to notice it. And then all of a sudden you're like, what just stopped? Something changed, because the sound stops, but you didn't know it was there. You just know something changed, and something changed dramatically. It's a very powerful thing. There was a thing called Hardware Wars back in the 80s, where they showed you a video. It's like a knockoff of Star Wars. And they showed you the video on one side of the screen. On the other side of the screen, they showed you all the things they were using to do the sound design. So like for a punch in Rocky, it would be like somebody cracking celery, and then they take that and they do several different samples, and then they layer that into the film. But it was like they were using everything from an egg beater to like different things on an exercise machine. I mean, it was really amazing to watch the creativity of how they actually put these sounds together.
Mhm.
But when you're watching a film, in the real world they're not stabbing somebody, but you certainly get the impression that they are.
Yeah.
And like a watermelon, a cantaloupe, those kind of melons are very common for that because they just have that sound that we now associate with murder.
Right. Right. It would just be like the sound of a knife coming out of like somebody's belt when you hear that, like that kind of like clink, that and you know that it's just like if I had a knife and like a saber or something, it probably wouldn't make that noise. But I mean, when you're looking on film, like even like something as simple as like somebody walking, and you hear like those footsteps really clear, like the clop, 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 clop. I've seen things like that before where they show somebody like really intentionally walking and making those noises. Like for film, you have to accentuate those noises because it wouldn't be as effective as if somebody was like just pulled a knife out or started running away and you didn't hear those kind of like exaggerated sounds.
Right. And a lot of times they have to do it because the audio just didn't capture the footsteps well enough.
Right.
Or, I mean, obviously the sound design, like with the stabbing, you have to because you didn't do anything on set that would actually create that sound. I actually did a panel at Phoenix Comic-Con one year that was talking about the use of music and sound in film. And one thing that I didn't have examples of at the time, but I've seen a lot of now is when people pull out a sword or a knife, you hear the sound of scraping metal, but you're not seeing it scrape anything. So we've now associated just like a knife being in the air or being pulled out of like a wooden knife rack, the sound of scraping metal, which makes absolutely no sense because if you go into your kitchen and you pull a knife out of your wooden knife rack, what sound are you hearing? You're not hearing the sound of metal scraping metal.
No, you're hearing nothing.
Right.
Basically.
But that goes to the psychological factor. You're watching Scream, the guy goes into the kitchen, he pulls a knife out. It sounds so much more intense because you're hearing that metal scraping sound. And now it's in your head that how sharp that knife must really be for it to make that sound. It's one of the most important tools in film, especially in horror.
Oh, I agree. And I mean, I think Scream is probably, any of the Screams is probably a great example of that because when he takes out that knife, it's also a very exaggerated. He holds it like that overhand thing. He pulls it out of his sheath or his belt or something, and you hear that really kind of crisp, like metal scraping sound. And I mean, part of your brain, like for a split second, knows that's not the sound it makes, but I mean, it makes the motion and like the scene more effective because you're just like, okay, that's a fucking sharp knife. Right. He's gonna get her with it,
And they do the same thing in martial arts movies. I mean, I don't know if you've ever used nunchucks in your life, but I have, and I know they don't sound anything like the way that they're portrayed in film. They don't make those sounds. They just don't.
Like that whipping sound, like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you might hear that if you're using it right by your own ear, but your opponent does not hear that.
Right.
But again, you're watching the film and it really just brings out the intensity of it. So it's such an important thing. But when you get to a movie like Jaws: The Revenge, where the shark is screaming because they electrocute him, sharks don't have the ability to make any sound whatsoever. They have no vocal cords. So that's where it kind of loses me, is where you can convince me of some things, but when it's so far beyond reality, that's where I have a hard time.
So somewhere in between there and where we started is like kind of in between. You have like the 60s and the 70s where they didn't quite have that technology yet. Yeah. And one of my favorites, which I know that I mentioned them, I don't know if you heard of them, is like Hammer Studios, like Hammer Films of the 60s and 70s. So are you familiar?
A little bit, yeah.
So those were some of my favorites because those were like gothic horrors, where they started off doing like these kind of I think it was like like historical or war movies. Like the Hammer Studios was like based in England, and so like around like the late 60s they were looking back on the Universal movies that we talked about in the 30s and 40s and said, well, we're going to remake these as horrors and using these really like classically trained like like wonderful actors like Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing were like great like Shakespearean
Oh,
level
yeah.
actors.
Right.
And to think that they like, and they did tons of these films like together and separately, and to think that they lent their talents to like these type of films, which horror movies were looked on as like, you know, like the low, like bottom feeder of movies, you know, never taken seriously. It's like those guys elevated those movies to like anything. So they redid Dracula. Christopher Lee was Dracula,
Right.
totally
Yeah.
different, you know, like he didn't do the, you know, the romantic cape and everything. He had the bloodshot eyes and like, you know, the fangs, and he was very like very violent Dracula. He was also the Mummy. Um, they redid Frankenstein, where Peter Cushing was Dr. Frankenstein, and it was very like very Victorian era, very gothic. So it was a different type of feel, very British, you know, type of thing. The feel that those movies had. There was like Brides of Dracula, which is you know, another one of my favorites. And you know, so they had a whole ton of movies like that. They even did a kind of historical one in the middle, Rasputin the Mad Monk,
Oh, wow.
which was Christopher Lee as Rasputin, which it wasn't as much of a horror film, but you know, just really portrayed him as just this violent, disruptive person, and it had the same feel as those other movies.
Right.
So they did a lot of like Dracula's, Frankenstein's, you know, kind of monsters and stuff in that kind of gothic Victorian style. Kind of culminating with one of my favorites, which was 1974, which was kind of the end of it, because they were doing like late 60s, early 70s.
Mhm.
And then probably like the early to mid 70s is when it kind of tapered off. And the last great one, in my opinion, was called Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, which was Peter Cushing's last turn as Dr. Frankenstein. And he had to hole up in a mental institution. So right off the bat, any like horror movie where like the setting is like in a mental hospital is like it's gonna be gold, you know.
Oh, yeah, especially back then, because mental
Yeah.
hospitals were like dingy and dark, and you
Yeah.
know, everything that you would associate with like an old medieval castle. You know,
So
but-
yeah, so it was great. So the you know, quick rundown is that there was a younger guy who was reproducing Frankenstein's experiments. Somebody found him out. He was thrown in the insane asylum because they're just like, you know, this is a crime against humanity. Finds out that Frankenstein is there working like under an alias. He actually didn't die. He was there continuing his work undercover in the asylum. And so he took this guy on as his protege, and they built a monster out of some of the inmates. Like, you know, he identified some of the inmates as like, this inmate has like, you know, skilled hands. This one has like a brilliant brain, even though they were insane. Cobbled
Right.
together this monster who winds up terrorizing the mental hospital. And, you know, they had to wind up destroying him.
Mhm.
And then at the very end, they're just like, Frankenstein was like, well, he goes, next time it'll be better. And he goes, what do you mean next time? And he was just like, well, you know, you don't think I've given up yet? And then he just, you know, starts sweeping up, and he's like, what do you think about, you know, such and such in cell 3? You know, he's just like, he has strong hands or something. And then you just see the other guy like looking off into the distance, like, oh my God, this guy's obsessed. He is never going to stop. And then it just pans out, and that's the end.
Wow.
And you're just like, whoa. And that's probably one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Definitely check it out.
Well, the mad scientist was a big theme back then too. And
Yeah.
now, where did Vincent Price land in all of this? Because he was a big. Wasn't he working with them on those films?
He wasn't in the Hammer films. He was like considered one of the big, you know, horror guys, but he was oh God, who was the other one? It was there was another kind of like considered like a budget horror studio, and it's really escaping my my mind right now. But Vincent Price had done some movies like with him, and you know, full disclosure, Vincent Price was never really one of my favorites. Like, you know, I'd never really watched his stuff because there were horror movies like in the 50s and 60s kind of like lost something for me. And I think Price like did a lot of stuff in the 60s, and it just wasn't really my thing, because like a lot of the 50s horror movies were you know, kind of like more like sci-fi was bigger. So like, you know, the robots from outer space and stuff like that. And they were very like flatly filmed too. So it's like they really lacked like that depth of like, you know, the the visuals and the music and the creepiness, and it was more like kind of utilitarian. It's just kind of like, you know like aliens are going to come take over the earth, or like, pods are going to come out, and or the thing and stuff like that. They
Yeah.
didn't have as much atmosphere,
Well,
in
we're
my
talking
opinion.
now getting into the nuclear age where the radiation was a big scare,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
people were building like actual bomb shelters to live in. The fallout was a big
yeah.
thing, and so it was a different era too. Sci-fi was really starting to take over the horror genre, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't really my favorite. I'd had a couple that I had liked, but I really liked more of the straight horror, like that last one that I had kind of
Yeah.
described to you, which kind of gets us into, like, past all that stuff into the 70s, when bigger budget movies. And that's why, like, Hammer Studios and the other one, I can't remember, it was like it was like some kind of acronym, or something like that. I'll probably remember later. But
Yeah.
like Hammer Studios and some of the more like indie films or smaller studios were being edged out by, like, by The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby. Like, these guys were like, big budget horror movies were jumping on the bandwagon and kind of like overtaking like these small independent productions, and so they started to go away. And under the what was the one with Jack Nicholson?
The
Um,
Shining.
yeah, The Shining. Like,
Mhm.
some of those were like big budget studio horror
Yeah.
movies, and so
Right.
they started to overshadow movies like the ones that I was talking about, which I personally felt had a lot more, kind of atmosphere and like heart to them.
Mhm.
And these other ones were just like, for the time, anyways. They had the budget to do, like, the blood coming on the floor and everything, and just the,
Right.
maybe special effects stunts. The Omen, is another
Mhm.
one.
Yeah.
So those type of movies weren't really my favorites. They were a little kind of like slick for my liking. Even though you had like Mia Farrow and Gregory Peck, and like you started to have the Jack Nicholson. You had these bigger names in the big studios,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And even though something like The Exorcist was really like terrifying, like, I mean, I was scared shitless of that when I was a kid.
Mhm.
Because you had like, you had the religious aspect, and like, the devil, and like, just the creepy sound effects and the makeup and everything just all going together. But also a lot of it was just kind of like very kind of like dead air. You know what I mean? Like, the story was
Right.
very slow and plodding to
Mhm.
get to, to build up to like what was really terrifying, which, honestly, I came to appreciate later, because that really built that sense of dread.
Well,
um
I think if you're seeing it in the theater, you're kind of going along for the ride. If you're watching it at home, it's a little less tolerable, that build,
yeah.
because it is very slow. And a couple years ago, I saw they had 2001: A Space Odyssey for like $2 at our local used shop, right?
Wow.
I'm like, man, I have not seen this since I was a kid. This is going to be amazing. 30 goddamn minutes of monkeys staring at us at pole, and I'm like, this is, how did anybody think this was great art? This is way too slow of a build. Like, you could have done this in 3 minutes, in and out, we're in space.
Yeah.
And I couldn't hang with it. I watched maybe 10 minutes of it, and I just started fast forwarding through it. I'm like, they're still looking at this pole. Like, I mean, it was just so slow. But had I been in the theater, the anticipation would have been building, especially when it was, when it was first released. I think the first time
Mhm.
I saw it was on television, when it came out on network TV. But yeah, some of those, there's a strategy to it, and there's a benefit to a build, but it's got to move at a pace that's worth sitting through all that. And The Exorcist, interestingly, I think was. Whereas 2001, no, I don't think that anything's worth me watching monkeys for half an hour.
Well,
um,
I mean, that was the type of stuff that was really dominating like the 70s.
yeah.
And then you get into the late 70s and the early 80s, where you get into like the slasher movies, which became really big.
Well, before
Um,
you get to there, I have an Exorcist story.
yes.
So years ago, a friend of mine was doing a comic convention. Was doing all of them at the time, and she was doing one in Tempe, Arizona, and I lived pretty close there. And I found out Linda Blair was going to be there, because I said, well, I'll come down and visit you, see if you need anything, because she was going to be by herself, and she's stuck in this booth. You can't get out and get food or whatever. So I said, I'll come by and check on you. So I found out Linda Blair was going to be there, and I'm like, well, I got to meet Linda Blair. Like, how do you not do that?
Yeah.
So I go check out my friend. I'm like, I'm going to go meet Linda Blair, and then I'll come back. I don't know how long the line's going to be. I don't know how long it'll take. So I get there, and it was a pretty small convention. There weren't a lot of people at that time, and so I didn't have to wait very long. And this guy, you want to support them. They're there to make money, as well as greet their fans and stuff. So I bought a picture for her to sign, and I saw they had the cover of The Exorcist as one of the pictures that you could get. And I don't know who the guy was that was with her. And I really wish I'd have found out, because he must have been somebody that was involved with that picture. Because I was looking at it, he goes, do you like that one? I said, yeah. He goes, let me ask you this. Who's in that picture? And I said, well, that's Max von Sydow. And he goes, nope. Max von Sydow didn't show up until the day after that picture was taken. And I look at it again. I'm like, I think you're wrong, because that's Max von Sydow. Like, I'm looking at the shape of the guy, and I don't know if they doctored it maybe a little bit to be more his shape, whoever the stand-in was, but it was not Max von Sydow. And I don't know. He goes, no one knows for sure who it was. I mean, it could have been just like a guy that was on set. They're like, hey, can you stand in there so we can take the shot? We're going to fix it later.
Huh.
And I'm like, I don't know who it was. It was actually in the picture. So I met Linda. She was super sweet. She kept asking me if I had seen Repossessed, which was her comic film that she did with Leslie Nielsen.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, I just watched that a couple weeks ago. I said, but I also watched Night Patrol last night. She goes, oh yeah, Night Patrol was good. Hey, did you watch Repossessed? I'm like, yeah, I just told you I watched it like 2 weeks ago. And then I met, I don't know how to say the guy's name, so I'm not going to say it. And this will go to one of my picks later. But I met the guy that was Leatherface in the first reboot series of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So the Jessica Biel one, and then the prequel that they did after that. He was also in Any Given Sunday. He was one of the football players. Really big guy. I mean, just like physically has a really big frame. And I wish I'd have never met him. I don't know what was going on with him. He was not all there. And apparently the next day he ended up getting kicked out of the convention for being belligerent, and it was not a good time in his life. So but yeah, so I got to meet Linda Blair, which was a really cool moment. Yeah, that's my Exorcist story.
Well, who knows who's on that poster then?
Yeah, I'm really curious. I'll have to do some digging and see if maybe somebody's come up with an answer. It seems like even if they just said it was like some guy on set, I'd be like, okay, at least we know, who it was. But it was probably just a stand-in.
You brought up the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I almost forgot about, just because that's like that was like 70s. Like I can't remember. Was it? Yeah, it was early to mid 70s. I think.
I think so. Yeah, the original one I think was 78, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. It was now I gotta look.
That was a breakthrough film.
That was 74.
Oh, 74, okay. Yeah, I first heard of that film. I don't know if you'd seen it, because back in the 80s they used to do these like compilation movies that would kind of promote the horror genre. Mm-hmm. And there was one with Donald Pleasence and one of the people from Carrie, and it was called Terror in the Isles, and Nancy Allen. And they're in a movie theater and they're just like talking, and then they'll show some scenes from horror films. And they showed what I consider to be the greatest scene in any horror movie to this day, which is the first reveal of Leatherface.
Wow.
When he just comes out and smacks that person with the hammer, and then the way he slams that metal door, that moment to me is the greatest scene in any horror film I've ever seen.
Yeah, I'll have to say that was pretty like effective. It was very frightening. I remember the first time seeing that, because up until then it was just a bunch of hippie hitchhikers, and this kind of abandoned house and everything, and you're going in there and you're like, all right, this is kind of creepy. And then when he comes out and does that, it was just like not even 10 seconds, and you're just like, whoa, what just happened?
Because you don't even know what you're dealing with. Like, is it a person? Is it a beast? He has a really weird face. Is he deformed? Is he mental? Like, you have no idea. You just know that guy's big and he has a hammer and he doesn't like people.
Yeah, and that's I remember one of the first times I saw it, which I had some friends over for a sleepover, and I had to have been in high school, and I don't know, maybe like some of us fell asleep or anything, but I just remember waking up to like that scene.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
like the movie was kind of like slow, so it's, you kind of drift off or whatever. And I woke up to that scene, and then like the rest of it, like the chainsaw, like, him chasing the girl and everything like that. And it was just like, what the fuck am I even watching right now? Like, this is
Yeah.
terrifying.
Hmm.
Which was like, like I think that that's like kind of a very specific memory or way of seeing like certain horror
Oh,
films, like,
yeah.
going for the first time and like watching it and being like, oh, but also like, being at a friend's sleepover and kind of like dozing off and waking up halfway through like one of the most horrifying scenes, and that like that
Right.
affecting you
Yeah.
too,
Oh,
and being
sure.
like, holy shit, you
Well,
know?
and it was that was like the first really powerful murder movie, that was that graphic. And I think part of what bothered me about it was that I was under the impression, of course, we didn't have the internet or really anything to research with back then, but I was under the impression that that was a true story. And now, of
Mm,
course, I know it was just like so subtly based on Ed Gein, but
right.
because he never really killed anybody. Well, I think he killed one person, but he was a grave robber. But
Hmm.
everybody thinks of him as this mass murderer because his story has been used in all these horror films.
Right, right.
Still not somebody I'd hang out with, but not the right impression of the guy. But just thinking, like watching this movie and thinking, oh my God, this actually happened to people.
Yeah.
That put a reality in it for me.
Yeah, and that was another one too. Like, what if I was in this situation? If
Yeah.
my car had broken down and I got separated from my friends, and I was in this farmhouse with these insane people, like, basically like torturing me, like psychologically torturing me,
Mhm.
like, you're like, what would I even do?
Yeah,
You can't even wrap your head around it. So
yeah,
that was definitely like another turning point.
for sure.
Um,
I will jump ahead just briefly and talk about the reboot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, which was the follow up to the Jessica Biel movie. So this would be the prequel to that. So Jessica
mhm.
Biel's was kind of a remake of the '74 classic, and then this was the prequel story. I did I think a two-part episode on this last year or the year before. That is one of the best horror scores. I'm going to go out to say it is the best horror score of any movie, and Steve
Wow.
Jablonsky did it. He also scored all the hang on, excuse me. Almost all the Transformers movies. He didn't do the most recent one, but he did all the other ones. He did Desperate Housewives. He did
Mhm.
Ender's Game, all kinds of stuff. He did I think Transformers was The Island, which was the other movie that made me want to be a film composer. So The Island and the original miniseries of it. But that score, like, check it out. It is unbelievable,
Mhm.
absolutely unbelievable. My second would be The Shining. I think the music to The Shining is just
Yeah.
untouchable, untouchable. But yeah, so Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes out. We had a little gap because I think Halloween was '78.
Halloween was 78, so now we're jumping ahead a little bit. So Halloween was like the almost like the precursor to the slasher films of the
Mhm.
80s, which the original Halloween, one of my favorites, hands down, because that really exemplifies what like a horror movie should be.
Yeah.
And it really relied on like a lot of what it built on from those earlier movies that we talked about from like the 20s and 30s is like what you didn't see.
Yeah.
And what I liked about it was is if you read about any of the behind the scenes stuff was is like that production was like really industrious.
Mhm.
Like they had to really go through everything with like a shoestring budget and a can-do attitude. It's like
Yeah.
Jamie Lee Curtis had to buy all of her own clothes
Mhm.
for the role. Like they didn't costume her. It was just like here's like $100, go to J.C. Penney,
Right.
and
Yeah.
you're gonna decide what to wear.
Mhm.
The infamous story of them needing a mask for the killer and getting the William Shatner mask and spray painting it and cutting the eyes out. I mean,
Right.
that's having to basically work with what you have, and like that forces you to be really creative. And those are the things that I think make the lasting impression, as opposed to having millions of dollars in a big think tank and everybody throwing their their opinions in and like, tweaking all the effects and everything. Like that's what gives a movie like real personality. And
Yeah.
that's why I think it holds up.
Well, I think that and they made you feel like you were there.
Yeah.
Like you were a part of it. You almost felt the crisp autumn air,
Yeah.
even if you were in a heated house watching that movie, because so much of it was outside. You've got the fall leaves everywhere, and they did such a good job bringing a reality to that. And also the score. I mean, without the Halloween theme,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was a major component. The Halloween theme, and there was another piece in there, which was a slower piece that they used in the middle of the score. I can't remember if that was in the original or if that didn't come out until part two. But the music, again, they showed you enough to give you an understanding without showing you too much.
Right.
It was starting to show you a little more than Psycho, but not as much as like Saw.
Right. And then you had Donald Pleasance in there, who was like another great actor, who was in some of those Hammer films that I had mentioned like early on.
Yeah.
And just really adding like an air of like legitimacy to it, because like another just great actor, and he just comes in and he's just like the voice of reason, like we have to stop him. He's like he's otherworldly, he's evil, and he's just like, and you believe him because you're just like, all right, this guy is like, he's like obsessed with stopping him, and he's known him for 15 years, whatever, like you got to stop him. And there's a lot of that light and shadow, like a lot of the movie was like in darkness, and so it really kind of gave you that, at least for the time, because that was around the time that I grew up. Like it was a couple of years that came out a couple of years after I was born, but I mean, you still had the feeling, like you said, the crisp autumn night, but it would give you like the kind of the dark house or the dark outside was kind of like gave you that feeling of being home alone, like without your parents, like with the lights being really dim, and it just kind of being like this kind of creepy evening. It really set the tone really well.
Yeah. And then when she stabs him in the eye with the coat hanger, and you think he's down, and then the way that he just gets up like the Undertaker, he's just like, all right, that was fun. Now I'm serious,
Yeah.
But I think Donald Pleasance was a big key to that movie too, because the way he described Michael, I mean, you felt so much fear coming out of this man. I mean, classically trained actor, very talented guy. They really nailed the casting on this movie. Because when I listen to other actors and they're talking about like the history of whatever the killer is or whatever, I've never heard anybody deliver a speech like the way Donald Pleasance did. That was gold.
Yeah, I mean, he really, he cemented that movie. I mean, it's just it's one of those things where like all these different elements got together and it just worked.
Yeah. Where it becomes confusing is now there's been 5 different offshoots of Halloween, and some of them start from the original timeline and then branch off into their own thing. Jamie Lee Curtis has been in 3 different series that partially do and partially don't. Like it's the Halloween universe has gotten very confusing.
Yeah.
Then I did think it was really cool though that when Rob Zombie went to do his versions, his reboots, that he brought Danielle Harris back, who was in parts 4 and 5 of the original series. Then you have Halloween 3, which nobody counts because it had nothing to do with anything. But I thought that was cool.
I liked 2 because it had Jamie Lee Curtis. It was a continuation of the same night. It had the same feel, and it was in a hospital, single setting in a hospital. So I thought it had a very similar feel to it. So even though the original sequel was kind of discounted, I thought that it was really good, because you had a lot of the same like team, or almost the same team, working on it, and it was only a couple of years later.
I don't know why they discounted that movie in the final series with Halloween Ends. I don't know why they discounted the second movie. There's no reason those events didn't happen.
Yeah, I was really excited to hear when Jamie Lee Curtis was coming back to the franchise and having the movies made over the past few years, and I was like, I of course I saw them and overall was kind of disappointed. Like I feel like they could have done like one and wrapped it up. And instead they kind of dragged it out over a couple of more movies. And,
Yeah.
it didn't really, I mean, they were okay. You know what I mean? It was cool to see, but
I didn't like the H2O series very much.
no,
I mean, the whole thing with all the people, like Coolio, I think was in it, and like all the people in the house doing the cameras and stuff. Like, it was just such a here's how we shoot modern horror film. It didn't really feel, it didn't have that naturalness. I liked the idea of the new series. I didn't like the way it ended. I didn't like the way the second to the last movie ended with like her realizing that he's not a human being, that he's like some kind of mythical creature. And I'm like, but where did that come from? How does that happen?
Yeah.
I that kind of lost me there. And the last one, I thought, well, I know it's going to end. She's going to finally get victory over him because she has to at some point,
So, yeah, I mean, that was, but I mean, I think originally, like the original, was always, for me, the best. And then
the first two, I would say the first two were,
yeah, definitely. And I mean, when you're coming into the early 80s now, these are the ones that I grew up with. So then you have Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, which are two of the big ones for me. And again, like the first couple of each one were my favorites. And then once you get past like 2 or 3, I'm kind of out,
Well, let me ask you how you're doing on time, because I know you have to work today.
I could probably do another 15.
Okay, perfect. I think the big confusion over Friday the 13th is that people focus so much on the Jason character.
Yeah.
He wasn't even in the first one.
And that's a big kind of gotcha for everybody. It's like, hey, do you know that Jason wasn't even? Yeah, we know it was Betsy Palmer, right? It was Jason's
yeah, but
mom.
People are still like, oh, I remember Jason in the first. Like, no, he wasn't.
The hockey mask wasn't even until the
third or fourth one. Yeah.
Third,
But let me ask you though. Yeah. Okay, so the end of the first one, the girl, she kills the mom. Great decapitation scene, by the way.
Yeah.
She's in the boat, and then Jason comes up out of the water, and in her dream sequence. I have a hard time. It's like they always have to try and get you one last scare. Mm-hmm. They can't just end the story and go, we'll pick it up in the next one. They always take it one step too far.
Yeah.
Misery did that too with him in the restaurant at the end, and she's the waitress.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
just leave it,
Yeah, just stop it.
I mean, I didn't mind it that much. I thought, like, going back and seeing it later and realizing, like, when I was older, that okay, Jason wasn't actually in the first one. I thought it was much creepier having her acting, kind of having that dual kind of personality with her son, almost like a reverse Norman Bates type of thing.
Yeah.
And I thought that the score also mirrored another callback to Psycho. Was like that score was all stringed instruments, which was also what happened in Psycho.
Right.
So I thought that was very a kind of a cool callback, or something that, unless you're a real film nerd, you wouldn't really notice that. But that's what really made, I think, the original Friday the 13th very unnerving, because it was just all like that really frenzied string instrument kind of intro, and then when you had the
Mm-hmm.
and then you had the little guitar strum under it, it was like, wow.
And that was really another breakthrough movie, because I mean, first of all, it was the first camp movie, but it took that isolation from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where you've got your group of people, you've got a legitimate reason to be where they're at, got a legend that they're starting with, that now it's so cliche when they tell the legend of whatever the creature is at the beginning of the movie, you already know how it's going to play out. But this was where you look at it now and you're like, well, the special effects aren't that great, and the movie doesn't really move that fast. But in the late 70s, or whenever it came out, that was groundbreaking. There was nothing like that before that came out.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think that that was that first one was I think unparalleled, because then everything that it built on after that just kind of like it just kept diluting it.
Yeah.
I mean, there were some some decent drive-in type scares, like if you wanted to, like there was like the 3D one,
Right. Yeah.
and stuff like that. There were some decent ones where it's, if there was like, I remember when it was Friday the 13th, like when the 13th fell on a Friday, there would be, and I'm sure it just didn't happen here, local channel 38 or whatever it was, local station would always run a Friday the 13th marathon,
Yeah.
on TV of the movies. And I always get so excited and watch all of them. It didn't matter if they sucked, you know. Right. It was just like, it was horror movies, cool. But I think after that, I mean, I think I can't remember what 2, 3, 4 and on were all about. I just remember the first one distinctly.
Well, they only get specifically memorable when you get to like Jason Takes Manhattan or Jason X, which was in space, because those are very specific set. The rest of them are like, I don't know if this camp death was in this movie or that movie. But I'll tell you something interesting about the series. I read the book to Friday the 13th, part 6, I think it was. And that's the one where they start out, Tom Matthews, who was in the Return of the Living Dead movies. He comes out and they dig Jason up and they put that metal pole in him, which of course gets hit by lightning, and they bring him back to life while trying to make sure he's dead. Crazy premise. But I mean, if you accept that this guy even exists, you kind of just are like, all right, I'm agreeing to whatever I'm walking into.
Right,
you know?
right.
But the book was really interesting because the book told the story from the perspective of Jason. Everything else was kind of narrated so you knew what was going on.
Okay.
But the whole thing was he just wanted them to leave him alone. He just wanted to be dead and be at peace, and people keep waking him up, so he's got to kill everybody so that he'll be left alone. When you start to change the perspective now, he's not just this machine or you know, monster killer. He's like, all I want you to do is stop messing with me. And if you quit doing it, I'll quit doing it. We'll all be happy. And he's not getting what he wants. So he's like, all right, well, fine. Then I'll just get rid of everybody until there's no one around to wake me up.
Well, you know what? I'll get to that, the other one later, because to get to that, we have to talk to the Freddy versus Jason. You have to talk about Freddy.
Right.
Which, I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street, one of my absolute favorites. The first 3 movies are like untouched in my mind. Personally, I don't know which one I like better, the original or 3, because the third one, again, set in a mental hospital.
Right.
Dokken was had the Dream Warriors, and Vinnie Vincent Invasion had Love Kills on the soundtrack. So like it was right around that time where it was like I was into the music, and so you had the music, you had the mental hospital, you had the whole thing going on, young Patricia Arquette. So it's just like you know, that movie to me with the third one was like perfect. But I would say the first one was probably the most classic, but my favorite that I have the most memories with are probably the third.
I think it's interesting too that the first one was Johnny Depp's first movie. I mean, that was like, here's some guy, he's just a guy that gets killed. He's the boyfriend of the lead actress.
Yeah.
Would never think by looking at that movie that he would go on to have the career, because he was just another actor in a horror film, you know, no big deal at all. Yeah. And then to have the career that he's gone on to have is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's just like Kevin Bacon in the original Friday the 13th.
That's right. Yeah. Or Jennifer Aniston in the first Leprechaun movie.
Yeah. Yeah. You just, who knew? You know, everybody gets their start somewhere, right? So
yeah, exactly. But that was am I wrong in thinking that the first sarcastic killer would be Freddy, the first one that made jokes? And
I think like so. That? Even though the very first one, he was a lot more dark. Like he, you know, he was just like, he wouldn't come around the corner and just be like, you know, cracking jokes, or like, but I mean, you could tell he was taking glee in chasing them and torturing them, like in that opening scene with Nancy in the first one, where he's like running after her and he's like he's wielding his fingers and he's like he's cackling and laughing, like he's enjoying it because he's fucking crazy. He's a child murderer. He gets off on it. Yeah. So, but he doesn't do like the quips and stuff he does like later on. Yeah. being like, welcome to my world, bitch, and all that
Right.
kind of,
Yeah. That
well,
kind of developed over time. And I don't know if that started in the second movie or not, but the franchise definitely changed. If you look at the later movies that were in that
yeah.
series compared to the first one, they're a completely different style of movie.
But I mean, I thought the concept of somebody invading like a group of people's dreams and killing them in their sleep, I think was very almost going back to the beginning of cinema, very kind of
Yeah.
surrealistic, kind of this otherworldly concept, even though like stabbing Jason or Michael Myers and then they come back to life is one thing, but it's like, okay, well, now we're not even talking on the same like plane of reality. We're talking about
Right.
people's like dreams.
Yeah.
And I thought that there were a lot of like crazy concepts in that. The only thing that I've come to accept from that movie, and it makes the movie, but one would think like, well, how much better would this movie be? Is like the woman who played the mother was like the worst actress I've ever seen. Like she was terrible. I had actually seen it recently, and she's just like, Nancy, you've got to get some sleep. And it's like, oh my God, I could act better than this fucking lady.
Did she do that thing they did in the 80s where they had the sweater that they just wrapped over their front and they just wore it like a coat almost?
I mean, probably.
Yeah.
She was, but I mean, you had like, I mean, the Heather Langenkamp was like really good as the young lead. John Saxon was like really good.
Yeah. Who had done Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee not long before that,
Yeah, even Johnny Depp, as a young actor, the other guys, I mean, they were pretty good. And then you had this ham who was just this horrible actress.
but this was also the first movie, if I'm not mistaken, with real special effects. I mean, some really first time seeing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, like the woman getting the girl getting dragged across the ceiling, the blood exploding out of the bed when in Johnny Depp's scene, the mother or Freddy falling into the bed or the mother like kind of like lowering or descending into the bed with the cloud. I mean, the smoke and everything. I mean, they weren't like top notch, but I mean, even like Freddy's like flamed footprints like toward the end going up the stairs. I mean, there was some pretty cool stuff, and I feel I feel like they could have taken a lot of liberties with doing special effects, because you're like, okay, this is the dream world, so like anything is possible.
Well, I think that's the advantage too, is that if you're in a certain universe, things have to make sense within the context of that universe. Like I mentioned, the shark screaming. Sharks can't scream. So right now you've lost me in that movie. But in a world like this, you're basically saying you can dream anything. So you can put anything you want in this film. You can have the pictures just start melting for no reason, because that's what's in the dream. But also this takes that isolation I've been talking about to a whole nother level. Because where in your life are you the most vulnerable? You're sleeping.
Yeah.
And that just escalated at times 10, the whole thing for me. I thought that was such a brilliant concept. And then from there, you can write anything you want into the script.
No, and they did.
And they did. Yeah. And they pulled it off. I mean, you're right. Looking at it now, the effects look a little bit cheesy only because of what we have now. But if you put yourself in 1981, 82, some pretty amazing effects.
I mean, I think so. I mean, when I watch movies from that era, I never think like, I mean, you notice that there's just like, oh, okay, that's obviously fake, or that's not up to the level of what you would see now. But you got to suspend your disbelief. You have to take your mind and put it into like, okay, I'm going to watch this movie and understand what era it's from.
Right.
And there's something endearing about it too. Like you don't want that movie to be perfect. You don't want them to go back and George Lucas it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Because that would ruin it.
Exactly. Like, we'll let people reboot it and then do it the way they want to, and that's fine. But don't touch...
and then I won't. Yeah, and then I won't go watch it. So
leave the classics alone. You want to redo it, fine, if you can get the rights or whatever. But like, I think Rob Zombie did a really good job with Halloween. I really do. It was a slightly different movie. I have issues with the whole, how is Michael Myers supernatural when he has no story to be supernatural? He wasn't struck by lightning. Nothing magical happened to him. How is this stuff possible?
Yeah. And it's yeah, exactly. And they never really explained that.
Yeah, Jason was dead. Jason came back from the dead,
right?
So he was already dead to begin with. So I can say, all right, well, you can stab him in the neck, and he's going to be like, okay, don't do that. I don't like that, and he's going to keep moving. I can buy that because that makes sense in that universe. The one thing I never understood about Michael Myers was how is he getting up after he's been shot or stabbed in the neck or poked in the eye, like that universe never made sense to me.
Well, right, because he was just a messed up little kid who killed his sister, was sent to an insane asylum, grew up in isolation and, you know, being talked to by doctors and therapists and stuff. And now all of a sudden it's just an unkillable monster.
Yeah. I mean, I get that mentally he's gone, but that doesn't make you have superhuman strength. It doesn't make you have the ability to drive a car, you know, and I don't know. I think there's things I love about that series, but if you really sit down and think about it, there's some real big plot holes.
But again, you know, you have to, for the sake of enjoying the movie, you want to probably just overlook those. I mean,
you have to suspend belief. Yeah, you have to say, I'm walking into this, like if I can accept Star Wars, if I can walk into a Star Wars movie and accept everything that's going on there,
yeah,
I should be able to just accept, okay, well, whatever, for whatever reason, he's this way. Now that I know that, let's just accept it and watch the movie. But sometimes when I come out of the movie, like if there's a scene where I'm like, oh wow, I'm at home watching a movie, I'm not there, I do start to think about those things. I'm like, wait a minute though. You know, and I don't try to be analytical, it just happens.
But I mean, it's a great thing about movies and TV is that once you're out of that universe, or even sometimes when you're in it, you're like, that would never happen. But I mean, you know, it's just like you have to suspend disbelief for these things. Otherwise, it's like, what's the point of movies and entertainment, right?
Right.
Yeah. It's supposed to be real.
I think there's a difference between if it was in a book. I think it's easier to accept in a book because you're not watching it. When you're watching it, you're convincing yourself that you're watching reality.
Right.
So I think it's harder to accept as a visual than it would be as words. But I hate to end this because we're on such a roll, but I know you got to go. So we're gonna have to pick this up. Whether we do it this year or next year, I don't know yet. We'll have to talk.
Oh, well, we're gonna have to save my thoughts on Freddy versus Jason for a year from now. Oh,
maybe not. We'll see. But yeah, because we're getting into a really amazing time in the horror world where horror films were just kind of exploding. A lot of things were border. Like E.T. has its moments where it's kind of like, there's some stuff in here where that could be really scary for some young kids and that kind of stuff. So everything started to have a little touch of it.
Yeah.
But horror movies were once again about to explode because people found the value. Studios are like, people are loving this. Let's jump on this. Let's get everything out we can right now. Give me your scripts today.
Yeah.
You know? So, well, thank you, John.
Thank you.
If we don't do this again until next year, happy Halloween. If we do this again before next year, happy Halloween.
You too. I have so much fun. I never get to talk about this stuff anymore. Just talk film and talk horror movies. I haven't in like so long. So this was so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah, and I never talk to anybody. So this is a lot of fun for me too. We'll do this again, my friend. In the meantime, have a great day, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see if there's another episode this year or not. Because as of right this moment, I don't know, but we'll find out. Cheers.